The strong smell of disinfectant invaded Jack's nostrils as soon as he crossed the door of the animal shelter. Barks echoed off the concrete walls, creating a chaotic symphony that made him hesitate for a moment. His heavy boots resonated on the cold floor as he followed the employee through the narrow corridors, observing the hopeful looks of the dogs in their kennels. Sarah, his sister, had insisted so much that he finally gave in. "You need to move on, Jack," she would say whenever she visited him at his isolated house on the outskirts of Portland. But how could he explain that it wasn't so simple? How to make her understand that no other dog could take Apollo's place? The cloudy afternoon seemed to reflect his state of mind as he passed by each kennel, purposely avoiding making eye contact with the animals. Some wagged their tails frantically, others just observed with tired eyes. Jack was ready to turn back, when Mary, the employee accompanying him, mentioned something that made him stop. "We have a special German Shepherd that arrived a few weeks ago," she said, her tone of voice subtly changing. "He's in the back of the shelter. Would you like to meet him?" Something in the way she spoke made Jack hesitate. His years of military training had taught him to trust his instincts, and now they were screaming that there was more to that suggestion. Then it appeared. He nodded silently and followed Mary to a more secluded area of the shelter. The dog was lying on the cold floor, apparently indifferent to their arrival. His posture was different from the other animals. There was no expectation, no fear, just a deep resignation that Jack knew all too well. It was then that he noticed the characteristic markings on the fur, the unique pattern he had engraved in his memory after so many missions together. The world seemed to spin for a moment. There, in that modest shelter in Portland, was Apollo. His Apollo, the same dog that had been his inseparable partner in the army, that had saved his life more times than he could count, but at the same time, it wasn't the same. The attentive gleam in his eyes had disappeared, replaced by an emptiness that cut through his heart. "Apollo?" he called softly, his voice trembling slightly. The dog didn't move, not even a muscle twitched at the sound of his name. Jack approached, slowly, each step calculated as if he were in a minefield. He knelt near the cage, trying to find in the animal's eyes some sign of recognition. "You know him?" Mary asked, surprised by his reaction. Jack didn't respond immediately. How could he explain years of partnership, trust, and mutual loyalty? How to describe the nights on watch, the missions accomplished, the moments of extreme danger where one depended on the other to survive? "He was my partner," he replied simply, his voice hoarse with emotion. "In the army." Mary's eyes widened, beginning to understand the situation. "He arrived here very hurt," she explained, choosing her words carefully. "Not physically, but you understand." Jack understood perfectly. It was the same type of wound that he carried, those that don't leave visible marks but change a person, or an animal, forever. Apollo had been retired from military service a few years ago, and since then Jack had tried to discover his whereabouts, without success. Now, seeing the state his former partner was in, a dull anger began to grow in his chest. "I want to take him," he said firmly, standing up. "Now." While Mary arranged the necessary paperwork, Jack remained beside Apollo's kennel, observing every movement, or lack thereof, of the animal. What had happened to him in these years? How had he ended up here, in a common shelter, when he should have been in a rehabilitation center for military dogs? The rain was starting to fall outside when they finally completed the adoption process. Apollo didn't resist when they put the leash on him, following automatically like a programmed robot. On the way to the truck, Jack noticed how the dog moved, differently, as if each step was a conscious effort. "Let's go home, buddy," Jack murmured, more to himself than to Apollo, as he helped him climb into the back seat. "Let's start over." The dog settled in silently, his eyes fixed on the landscape that began to pass by the window. Jack adjusted the rearview mirror to observe him while driving, his heart heavy with a mixture of joy at the reunion and concern for the state of his former partner. The rain gradually increased, and the drops hitting the windshield seemed to mark the rhythm of his thoughts. Jack knew that the road ahead would be difficult, but he was determined. Just as Apollo had never abandoned him in the most critical situations, now it was his turn not to give up on his friend. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give it a like. Tell us which city you're watching. Us from will continue. Jack's house, surrounded by old trees and cradled by the constant sound of wind in the leaves, seemed even quieter with Apollo's mute presence. The dog remained motionless in the truck's back seat even after the engine was turned off, as if waiting for some specific command. "Come, Don boy," Jack called softly, opening the back door. Apollo sniffed the air cautiously, his tense muscles evidencing discomfort with the unfamiliar environment. Only when Jack took a step forward and waited patiently did the animal finally descend, his movements measured and defensive. The rain had diminished to a fine drizzle, but Apollo flinched at every drop that touched his fur, as if each sensation was a potential threat. Jack carefully observed each reaction, his heart tightening as he saw how his former partner, once so confident and fearless, now seemed to fear even his own shadow. Inside the house, Apollo immediately chose a corner, above the living room, where he curled up with his eyes fixed on Jack's every movement. It was a strategic position, the ex-military man realized, that allowed the dog to observe both the front door and the hallway leading to the other rooms. Even in his current state, years of training still influenced his behavior. Jack decided to give the animal space, allowing him to familiarize himself with the environment at his own pace. He prepared the water and food bowl, placing them at a distance he judged comfortable for Apollo. The dog didn't move, but his nostrils moved slightly, sniffing the air. While preparing coffee for himself, Jack couldn't stop thinking about how he had arrived at this situation. The last time he had seen Apollo was during the retirement ceremony. For service dogs, the animal should have been sent to a specialized rehabilitation center, where he would receive all the necessary care for a smooth transition to civilian life. The sound of the kettle brought him back to the present, and that's when he noticed something peculiar. Apollo had slightly changed his position, his eyes now fixed on the kitchen. For a brief moment, Jack saw a glimmer of his old partner in that look, the same focused attention he demonstrated during missions. "You remember the smell of coffee, don't you?" Jack murmured, allowing himself a small smile. On long nights of vigilance, coffee had been his constant companion, and Apollo always became alert at the characteristic sound of the drink being prepared. But just as it came, the moment passed. Apollo lowered his head again, returning to his defensive posture. Jack sighed, sitting on the couch with his steaming cup. The television remained off. Any sudden noise seemed to deeply disturb the dog. The hours dragged on that first night. Jack tried to establish a routine, speaking in a low voice and moving predictably around the house. Occasionally he caught himself observing Apollo, looking for some sign of the partner he had known in the animal's gestures. It was during one of these moments of observation that he noticed something strange. Whenever footsteps approached the house, whether neighbors or people passing on the street, Apollo became even tenser, his muscles trembling slightly under his fur. It wasn't just fear, Jack realized. It was a conditioned response, as if the animal was expecting something specific to happen. Near midnight, when the silence was broken only by the distant sound of crickets, Jack decided to try something. He took his old military jacket, stored for years in the back of the closet, and gently placed it near Apollo. The familiar smell could help awaken some memory. To his surprise, Apollo reacted. Not dramatically, but his nostrils moved with more interest, and for a brief moment his head raised a few inches. It was minimal progress, but for Jack it represented a spark of hope. Before retiring to sleep, he prepared a comfortable spot for Apollo with soft blankets, but he knew the dog would probably not leave his chosen corner. Still, the gesture seemed important, a demonstration that here he had choices, that he was no longer trapped or limited. "Good night, friend," he said softly, heading to his bedroom. "Tomorrow is a new day." Lying in his bed, Jack couldn't sleep. His mind was buzzing with unanswered questions. What had happened to Apollo after his retirement? Why did he show clear signs of trauma? And mainly, how had he ended up in a common shelter in Portland, so far from where he should have been? A sudden noise made him sit up in bed. It was Apollo, moving in his corner. The sound of the dog's nails on the wooden floor had a specific pattern. He was walking in circles, a typical anxiety behavior. Jack resisted the urge to go there, knowing that his presence might only increase the animal's stress. The night would be long, but Jack was prepared. After all, it wouldn't be the first time he would spend hours on watch alongside Apollo. The difference is that now, instead of protecting each other from external threats, they were fighting against invisible ghosts of the past. The first week of living with Apollo was an exercise in patience. Jack observed how the dog maintained his own routine, always vigilant, always tense. During the day, he remained in his strategic corner in the living room, moving only when necessary and always keeping a safe distance from any approach. Sarah visited the house over the weekend, eager to meet her brother's new companion. Her reaction upon discovering it was Apollo was one of complete surprise. "It can't be," she exclaimed, lowering her voice when she saw how the dog flinched at her exclamation. "How did he end up in that shelter?" "That's what I intend to find out," Jack replied, serving coffee to his sister while keeping an eye on Apollo. The dog seemed especially agitated by Sarah's presence, as if visits represented some kind of specific threat. "Have you contacted your former superiors?" Sarah asked, her voice now in a more controlled tone. "They must have some explanation for this." Jack shook his head, his hands gripping the cup with contained force. "Not yet. First, I need to better understand what happened to him. Something's wrong, Sarah. Apollo was the best dog in the squad, trained for extreme situations. Seeing him like this—" A distant thunder interrupted the conversation. Apollo's reaction was immediate and shocking. The dog threw himself against the wall, trembling violently, his eyes wide with panic. Jack had never seen such an extreme reaction to a simple storm noise. "Hey, buddy, it's okay." He tried to calm him, keeping his distance but using a soft tone. "It's just rain." Sarah watched the scene with tears in her eyes. "Jack, he needs professional help. There are veterinarians specialized in trauma." "I know," Jack cut her off, his voice harsher than he intended. "Sorry, it's just, he wasn't like this. Apollo faced explosions, gunshots, all kinds of extreme situations without blinking. Something happened to him. Something serious." The rain began to fall harder, and each new thunder made Apollo cower more. Jack decided to try something different. He went to his room and came back with an old bag of military equipment. Inside it, he found what he was looking for, an old command whistle, the same one he used during missions with Apollo. "Do you think he'll remember?" Sarah asked, understanding her brother's intention. "There's only one way to find out," Jack replied, holding the whistle tightly. He approached a few steps towards Apollo and blew softly, producing the familiar sound he had used so many times to command the dog. The reaction was subtle, but it was there. Apollo's ears moved slightly, and for a brief moment his eyes focused directly on Jack. It was the first time since the reunion that the dog showed any sign of recognition. Encouraged, Jack tried one of the basic commands they used to use. "Apollo, attention!" he ordered, his voice firm but gentle. The dog didn't obey the command, but something in his posture changed. The trembling caused by the thunder diminished, as if the familiar sound of Jack's command voice offered some kind of anchor amid the panic. "Did you see that?" Jack whispered, emotional. "He's still in there somewhere." Sarah smiled, wiping away a tear. "Of course he is. You two have a special connection, Jack. You just need time to rebuild it." The rest of the afternoon was dedicated to small attempts at approach. Jack discovered that by using the whistle and specific voice commands from military training, he could capture Apollo's attention for brief moments. It was as if these specific memories were protected somewhere deep in the animal's mind. When Sarah said goodbye, already at the beginning of the night, the rain had ceased. "Keep me informed about his progress," she asked, hugging her brother. "And Jack, be careful when investigating what happened. I have a strange feeling about all this." Alone again with Apollo, Jack decided to start his investigation. He turned on the notebook and began researching the rehabilitation center where Apollo should have been sent after his retirement. The information was scarce, and something in the official tone of the available documents bothered him. It was during this research that he noticed something for the first time. Apollo had moved a few inches in his direction, his eyes fixed on the computer screen. Jack pretended not to notice, but his heart accelerated. It was another small sign that his partner was still there, observing, processing. Before going to sleep, Jack did something he hadn't done in years. He put on his old military uniform. The familiar fabric had a comforting weight, bringing memories of the times when he and Apollo were inseparable. He approached the dog slowly, sitting on the floor at a respectful distance. "Remember this, buddy?" he asked softly, indicating the uniform. "Remember all the missions we accomplished together?" Apollo raised his head, his gaze meeting Jack's for a few precious seconds. There was no longer the usual panic in his eyes, just a kind of distant recognition, like someone trying to recall an old dream. It was at that moment that Jack made a decision. He would find out exactly what had happened to Apollo during those years of separation, no matter what it took. His partner deserved justice, and more importantly, deserved the chance to recover. The bath wasn't in Jack's plans for that morning, but Apollo had completely dirtied himself during another of his nighttime episodes of digging in the backyard. It was the third time that week that the dog had spent hours digging deep holes in the earth, as if he was looking for something, or trying to escape from something. "Let's go, buddy," Jack said, carefully preparing the bath area. He had transformed the garage into a more welcoming space, preventing Apollo from feeling cornered. The dog followed him reluctantly, still distrustful, but at least he no longer needed to be carried. It was during the bath that Jack made the discovery. His experienced hands were passing shampoo through Apollo's fur when his fingers found something familiar behind the animal's right ear, an old scar with a very specific pattern. Jack froze, his mind instantly going back to that particular mission. "It can't be," he murmured, examining the mark more closely. It was exactly the same as the scar Apollo had gotten during an especially difficult operation when a shrapnel had hit him while protecting Jack from a nearby explosion. The confirmation that it really was his Apollo, not just a very similar dog, brought a wave of conflicting emotions. Relief for having absolute certainty, but also a growing anger when thinking about everything his partner must have gone through to reach that state. Apollo remained strangely quiet during the examination, as if he too was remembering that moment. Jack noticed other smaller marks, some he didn't recognize, and each of them increased his suspicions that something very serious had happened to his partner. After the bath, while carefully drying Apollo, Jack began to make mental connections. The dog's extremely defensive behavior, the panic with loud noises, the compulsion to dig holes, they weren't just symptoms of trauma, they seemed to indicate a specific pattern of experiences. Determined to find answers, Jack made some calls. First, he contacted Mary, the shelter employee, wanting to know more details about how Apollo had arrived there. The information he received was intriguing. The dog had been found wandering the streets of a distant neighborhood, apparently disoriented. "Did he have any identification?" Jack asked, holding the phone tightly. "No," Mary replied. "In fact, it seemed that any kind of identification had been deliberately removed. That's why it caught our attention." The conversation with Mary led Jack to his next contact, a former Army colleague who still maintained connections with the military dog unit. The call was tense from the start. "Jack, it's been a while." Robert's voice sounded cautious on the other end of the line. "How can I help you?" "I need information about Apollo." He went straight to the point. "I want to know where he went after retirement." There was a long silence before the answer. "You know I can't discuss that, Jack. It's confidential information." "Robert, he's with me now," Jack revealed, observing Apollo, who had returned to his usual corner. "I found him in a common shelter, completely traumatized. What kind of rehabilitation was that?" Another silence, heavier. "What do you mean he's with you?" Robert's voice betrayed genuine concern. That shouldn't be possible." "Why?" "Jack, officially Apollo was listed as non-recoverable a few months after retirement. After that, he simply disappeared from the system. Nobody knows or nobody wants to say what happened to him." The revelation hit Jack like a punch. Non-recoverable was a term that should never have been applied to Apollo. He was considered one of the best military dogs ever trained. "I need his records, Robert," Jack insisted. "All of them." "I can't help officially," Robert replied after a pause, "but I'll see what I can find out. Just be careful, Jack. There's something strange about this whole story." After hanging up, Jack noticed that his hands were trembling. Slightly. He looked at Apollo, who kept his eyes fixed on him with a different intensity. It was as if the dog understood that something important was happening. He went to his office and opened a drawer he hadn't touched in years. Inside was his old military agenda, with contacts and information that could be useful now. As he flipped through the yellowed pages, a movement in the window caught his attention. A black car, which he had never seen before, was slowly passing by the street. The driver seemed to be observing his house with particular interest. Jack instinctively memorized the license plate, years of military training coming back to the surface. Apollo, still in his corner, was completely alert now, his muscles tense and eyes fixed on the window. It was the first time Jack had seen him demonstrate this kind of focused attention since their reunion. "You noticed it too, didn't you?" Jack murmured, gently closing the curtain. "Something's going on here, partner, and we're going to find out what it is." The following week brought subtle changes to Jack and Apollo's routine. The black car had passed by 3 more times, always at the same time, always slowing down in front of the house. Apollo reacted the same way on all occasions. He remained completely still, only his eyes following the vehicle's movement. Jack began to notice a pattern in the dog's behavior. Apollo seemed more agitated at times close to the mysterious vehicle's passage, as if he could predict its approach. Years of military experience had taught Jack to trust his partner's instincts. "What do you know, buddy?" he murmured, watching. Apollo, who kept guard near the window. "What happened to you in those years?" The answer came in an unexpected way. That afternoon, while organizing some old documents, Jack found a photo of his old unit. In it, he and Apollo posed along with other soldiers after a successful mission. He decided to show the image to the dog. "Look at this here," he said softly. Sitting on the floor at a distance he knew was comfortable for Apollo, he placed the photograph on the floor and waited. The reaction was beyond his expectations. Apollo approached slowly, his muzzle moving more actively than usual. His eyes fixed on the image, and for the first time since their reunion, he made a sound, a small whimper that Jack knew well. It was the sound Apollo made when he recognized something familiar. Encouraged, Jack began to talk about the mission portrayed in the photo. "Remember that day, partner? It was when we found those lost supplies in the mountains. You sniffed out the entire way, didn't let anyone get lost in the fog." Apollo took another step towards the photo, now so close that his muzzle almost touched the paper. Jack continued talking, his voice maintaining the soft and familiar tone. That's when he noticed something strange. Apollo wasn't looking at him in the photo, but at another soldier who appeared in the background. "Lieutenant Thompson?" Jack asked, frowning. The officer had been transferred to the training center shortly before Apollo's retirement. "Did you see him after we separated?" The sudden tension in Apollo's body was answer enough. The dog took a few steps back, returning to his defensive posture. Jack mentally stored the information. There was some connection there that needed investigation. The next morning, Jack received an anonymous call. The grave voice on the other end of the line was direct. "Stop looking for answers, Duarte. Some doors are better left closed." "Who's speaking?" Jack demanded, but the call had already ended. Apollo, who was nearby, showed unusual agitation during the call. His eyes went from the door to Jack repeatedly, as if he were evaluating escape routes. It was a behavior that Jack recognized from their service days. Apollo did this when he sensed some imminent threat. The call only served to strengthen his determination. Jack spent the afternoon making more contacts, trying to locate Lieutenant Thompson. The information was contradictory. Some said he had retired, others that he had been transferred to a special unit. No one seemed to know his current whereabouts. It was during these investigations that Jack received a message from Robert. "Found something. Can't talk over the phone. Meet me tomorrow at Central Cafe, 10 a.m. The message brought a mix of apprehension and hope. Robert had always been cautious. If he was willing to have a personal meeting, the information must be important. "Jack," observed Apollo, who now alternated between watching the window and observing him with renewed attention. It was as if the dog understood that something was about to change. His ears moved at every external sound, his muscles ready for action. "We're going to discover the truth, partner," Jack promised, slowly approaching Apollo. To his surprise, the dog didn't back away this time. He stood firm in his position, his eyes meeting Jack's with an intensity he hadn't shown in weeks. That night, while preparing coffee before bed, Jack heard a different sound coming from the backyard. Apollo was standing near the fence, completely still, his body pointing to something in the shadows beyond the property. Jack turned off the lights and cautiously approached the window. For a moment he saw nothing beyond the darkness. Then a movement caught his attention. A figure was quickly moving away down the side street. "They're watching us, aren't they?" he murmured to Apollo, who maintained his alert posture. "But they don't know you like I do, partner. They don't know what we're capable of together." The wind was shaking the trees outside, creating dancing shadows in the yard. Jack carefully closed the curtains, his mind already planning the next steps. Tomorrow would be a decisive day, and for the first time since their reunion, he felt that Apollo was truly by his side, ready to face whatever came. Central Cafe was practically empty when Jack arrived, 10 minutes before the scheduled time. He chose a table in the back from where he could observe both the entrance and the street movement. Old military habits never die. Leaving Apollo at home was a difficult decision, but necessary. The dog was more alert than usual that morning, as if he sensed the importance of the meeting. Sarah had offered to stay with him, and surprisingly, Apollo seemed more receptive to her presence now. Robert arrived punctually, his face showing the tension he carried. He sat down without ceremony, placing a folder on the table. "I only have 20 minutes, he said, nervously looking around. "What I'm going to show you, well, technically this doesn't exist." Jack watched as Robert opened the folder and slid some documents towards him. They were internal reports from the rehabilitation center, all stamped as confidential. "Apollo wasn't the only one," Robert began, his voice low and controlled. "There were other dogs, all veterans of special missions, all classified as non-recoverable." After passing through the center, Jack examined the documents, his heart accelerating with each new piece of information. The reports showed a disturbing pattern: highly trained dogs being declared unfit after short periods in the rehabilitation center. "This doesn't make sense," Jack murmured. "These animals were the best we had. Their training—" "Exactly," Robert cut him off. "Their training was exceptional. Maybe that was the problem." "What do you mean?" Robert hesitated, checking the surroundings again before continuing. "Remember the project for developing advanced conditioning techniques, the one Lieutenant Thompson was coordinating?" Jack nodded. The project had been a source of controversy within the unit, with rumors about questionable methods being employed. "Well, apparently he didn't stop there," Robert continued. "After the restructuring of the rehabilitation center, Thompson took command, and he started implementing experiments." The word fell like a bomb on the table. Jack felt his stomach churn at the thought of Apollo being subjected to experiments. "What kind of experiments?" "I'm not sure," Robert replied, passing another document. "But I found records of significant transfers of medical and behavioral equipment to the center, much more than would be necessary for simple rehabilitation." Jack examined the new document, noting dates and values. "This was right after Apollo was sent there." "Yes, and there's more." Robert lowered his voice even further. 3 months after Apollo disappeared from the system, there was a surprise inspection at the center. The official report says it was a routine visit, but I received information that it was the result of an anonymous complaint. Something about unauthorized procedures being performed on the animals. Jack felt his jaw tighten. "And what happened?" "Nothing," Robert shrugged. "The center was temporarily closed for restructuring, Thompson was transferred, and all previous records were classified as confidential." A waiter approached to take their orders, causing Robert to immediately fall silent. After ordering 2 coffees, he continued, even more quietly. "Jack, there's something big going on here. Something that powerful people want to keep secret. The fact that Apollo has appeared now, this is no coincidence." "Where is Thompson now?" Jack asked, already knowing he wouldn't receive a satisfactory answer. "Officially? Retired. In practice, nobody knows, or nobody wants to say." Robert looked at his watch and began to collect the documents. "My time is up. I'll leave these with you." He separated some sheets. "The rest I need to return before they notice they're missing." Before standing up, Robert held Jack's arm. "Be careful, friend. You're not the only one looking for answers, and not everyone wants the truth to come to light." Jack remained at the cafe for a few more minutes after Robert's departure, studying the documents left behind. Each new piece of information seemed to open more questions than answers. His phone vibrated. It was a message from Sarah. "Apollo is restless. I think you better come back." On the way home, Jack couldn't stop thinking about everything he had discovered. The pieces were starting to fit together, forming a disturbing picture. Apollo's behavior, the mysterious cars, the anonymous call. He parked in front of his house and immediately noticed that something was different. The front door was ajar and the silence coming from inside was too heavy. "Sarah," he called, his heart accelerating as he climbed the porch steps. "Apollo?" The interior of the house was a mess. Furniture out of place, drawers open, papers scattered. Sarah was sitting on the couch, a superficial cut on her forehead. "They took him, Jack," she said, her voice trembling. "They took Apollo." If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give it a like. Tell us which city you're watching us from. We'll continue. Jack examined every inch of the house looking for clues, while Sarah, already recovered from the initial shock, reported the incident to the police over the phone. His military mind catalogued every detail. Shoe marks on the floor, drawers searched, with a clear purpose, the absence of forced entry on the door. They knew exactly what they were looking for, he concluded, observing how only certain areas of the house had been searched. His military documents, the folder with the information Robert had provided, everything had disappeared. Sarah hung up the phone with a frustrated sigh. "The police said they'll send a patrol car, but without signs of serious violence or significant theft." "It doesn't matter," Jack cut her off, his voice controlled but firm. "This goes beyond the police, Sarah. You can describe who invaded the house?" "There were 3 men," she began, closing her eyes to concentrate. "Professionals, very organized. They entered as if they had done this hundreds of times before. Apollo—" She hesitated, and Jack approached, holding her hand in support. "Go on, please. I need to know everything." Apollo changed completely when they entered. He wasn't the scared dog from the last few weeks anymore. It was as if he recognized them. He started growling, trying to break free from the leash. One of them said something like Sigma Protocol, and Apollo just stopped. He became totally still. Jack felt a chill run down his spine. Sigma. Protocol wasn't a standard command in military training. What had they done to his partner at that rehabilitation center? "After that," Sarah continued, "they simply put a muzzle on him and took him away. Apollo didn't resist. It was as if he was in a trance. I tried to stop them. That's when—" She touched the small cut on her forehead, and Jack felt his anger grow. "You couldn't have done anything, Sarah. They are trained professionals." At that moment, his phone vibrated. It was a message from an unknown number. "Old Paper Factory, Overlook Road, 10 p.m. Come alone if you want answers about Apollo. Jack." Showed the message to Sarah, who immediately protested, "It can't be a coincidence. It's obviously a trap." "Probably," he agreed, already mentally calculating how long it would take to get to the location. "But it's the only lead we have." "Jack." "Please," Sarah pleaded. "Let the police handle this. These men are dangerous." He shook his head, his face determined. "The police can't help, Sarah. This involves secret military operations, unauthorized experiments. Apollo is in danger, and I'm the only person who can help him now." While preparing to leave, Jack received another message, this time from Robert. "Thompson was seen in town. Be careful." The pieces were starting to fit together. Apollo's reappearance at the shelter hadn't been by chance. Someone wanted Jack to find him, to start asking questions, but why? "I'm coming with you," Sarah declared, grabbing her purse. "No, Sarah, I need you to stay here," Jack held his sister's shoulders. "If something goes wrong, you're my only connection to the outside world. Besides, I need you to contact Robert. He has important information." Reluctantly, Sarah agreed. As Jack prepared, she watched him with concern. "How are you going to face them alone?" A small smile appeared on Jack's face. "Who said I'm going alone?" He took the old military whistle he used with Apollo out of his pocket. "They may have some kind of control over him now, but Apollo and I have a connection that goes beyond training." On the way to the abandoned factory, Jack mentally reviewed everything he had discovered. Thompson's secret project, the experiments with military, dogs, Apollo's sudden reappearance. There was a pattern there, a bigger story that he still couldn't fully comprehend. The sun was beginning to set when he parked a few blocks from the designated location. The old paper factory rose against the orange sky like a shadow of the region's industrial past. Jack checked his watch. He still had 2 hours until the scheduled time. Enough time to study the terrain and prepare. Years of military training came to the surface as he observed the location from a distance. Entry and exit routes, blind spots, possible ambush locations, everything was methodically catalogued. But his biggest concern was Apollo. What did that Sigma protocol mean? How had they gained such control over such a well-trained dog? And most importantly, would his connection with Apollo be strong enough to break this conditioning? The wind was blowing stronger now, bringing dark clouds from the horizon. Jack squeezed the whistle in his pocket, feeling its reassuring weight. "I'm coming, partner," he murmured to himself. "Hold on." Night had fallen completely when Jack approached the abandoned factory. The clouds covered the moon, making the shadows even denser. He moved silently across the terrain, his steps sure despite the darkness. 2 security cameras had been recently installed, he noticed. For a supposedly abandoned location, there were clear signs of recent occupation. New wires ran along the peeling walls, and a silent generator hummed somewhere nearby. It was 15 minutes before the scheduled time when Jack detected movement. A car was approaching slowly, its headlights off. He immediately recognized it. It was the same black vehicle that had passed in front of his house in recent days. The car parked near the main entrance and 3 men got out. Jack observed them from a distance, noting their coordinated and professional movements. One of them carried a metal briefcase, while another firmly held Apollo's leash. His heart tightened at the sight of his partner. The dog walked mechanically, with no reaction to his surroundings. The muzzle was still in place, and his eyes seemed empty, devoid of that spark of recognition he had begun to show in recent days. "Punctual as always, Duarte," a familiar voice sounded behind him. "Some military habits never change." Jack turned slowly, finding exactly who he expected. "Lieutenant Thompson." "Ex-lieutenant, actually," Thompson corrected, emerging from the shadows. He was older than Jack remembered, but his eyes maintained that unsettling intensity. Although titles mean little when you're doing truly important work. "What kind of work involves torturing trained dogs?" Jack asked, his voice controlled despite the anger he felt. Thompson laughed softly. "Torture? No, Duarte. What we did was evolution, improvement. You have no idea what we achieved with the Sigma protocol." The other men approached, bringing Apollo with them. The dog remained in his almost catatonic state, oblivious to Jack's presence. "Complete mental control," Thompson continued, indicating Apollo with a gesture. "No hesitation, no questioning, no emotional ties interfering with performance. The perfect soldier." "You destroyed everything that made them special," Jack retorted. "The initiative, the loyalty, the ability to make decisions in the field." "Decisions?" Thompson cut him off. "Decisions lead to errors, Duarte. Emotions lead to failures. What we created is superior in every aspect." Jack observed Apollo, remembering all the times the dog's instinct had saved them, how his loyalty went beyond simple training. Superior? Then why did he escape? Something changed in Thompson's face. An unfortunate setback, but it served a greater purpose. It led us to you. Me? What do I have to do with this? You were the last obstacle, Duarte, the last defender of the old method. Your influence on the training program was still too strong. We needed to completely discredit you. The realization hit Jack like lightning. You planned all of this. You let Apollo appear at the shelter. We knew you wouldn't resist, Thompson confirmed. And now that you've started asking questions, investigating, well, some accidents are inevitable in this line of work. Jack felt the weight of the whistle in his pocket. All his military training screamed that he was at a disadvantage, surrounded. But there was something Thompson didn't understand. Something that no control protocol could completely erase. You know what your mistake was, Thompson? Jack asked, his hand moving slowly towards his pocket. You thought you could erase years of partnership, of mutual trust, with your experiments. But there's something stronger than any conditioning. Spare me the sentimentalism, Duarte. Thompson made a gesture, and the men began to approach. Apollo Sigma Protocol active. The dog positioned himself, his muscles tense, ready to attack. But Jack showed no fear. Instead, he slowly removed the whistle from his pocket. Remember this frequency, partner? He asked softly, showing the whistle to Apollo. Remember how many times it guided us home? This won't work, Thompson said, but there was a note of uncertainty in his voice. The conditioning is absolute. Jack brought the whistle to his lips and blew, not the sharp command sound, but a specific sequence that he and Apollo had developed together, something that had never been recorded in any training manual. For a moment nothing happened. Apollo remained motionless, his empty eyes fixed on Jack. Then slowly his ears moved. A subtle tremor ran through his body, and his eyes blinked once, twice. Impossible, Thompson muttered, taking a step forward. Apollo Sigma Protocol attack command. But something had changed. Apollo's gaze was no longer empty. There was recognition there, a spark of consciousness returning. His muscles trembled, as if he were fighting against the conditioning. Come here, partner, Jack called softly, blowing the whistle once more. Come home. Time seemed to have frozen in the old factory. The wind blew through the broken windows, creating ghostly sounds that echoed off the deteriorated walls. Apollo remained at the center of that surreal scenario, his body still trembling with the internal conflict between conditioning and memories that were beginning to awaken. Don't be foolish, Duarte. Thompson took a step forward, his voice betraying nervous irritation. Years of research, millions in investment. You really think a simple whistle can undo all of that? Jack kept his eyes fixed on Apollo, deliberately ignoring Thompson and his men. He blew the whistle again, this time incorporating a variation. He used only in special situations, when they needed silent communication during night missions. Apollo's ears moved again, and a low, almost inaudible sound escaped his throat. It wasn't a threatening growl, but rather that small whimper that Jack knew so well, the sound the dog made when he perceived something important during missions. It's working, Jack whispered, taking a small step towards Apollo. You're coming back, partner. Thompson pulled something from his briefcase, a small electronic device that made Apollo instantly cower. Enough of this nonsense. Apollo Sigma Protocol, maximum level. The dog let out a yelp of pain that cut through Jack's heart. It was the same sound he had heard so many times during the nights when Apollo had nightmares, the same nightmares he now began to understand. Stop, Jack ordered, his voice filled with authority. Don't you see you're hurting him? Hurting? Thompson laughed bitterly. You still don't understand, do you? Pain is just a physiological response, an obstacle to be overcome. With the Sigma Protocol, we created soldiers that can ignore any physical or emotional limitation. Sinu, Thompson spoke. Jack noticed something subtle in Apollo's posture. The dog had slightly changed his positioning, his muscles tensing in a specific way that Jack immediately recognized. It was the posture Apollo assumed when he was preparing to disobey a direct command, something that had happened only twice in his entire military career, always when the dog's instinct perceived a danger that humans had ignored. You know what your biggest mistake was, Thompson? Jack asked, his voice calm despite the tension of the moment. You studied our training methods, our commands, our protocols, but you never really understood what makes a military dog special. Thompson pressed a button on the device, making Apollo writhe again. And what would that be, Duarte? Love? Loyalty? Cheap sentimentalism? Trust, Jack replied simply. The ability to think independently, to make their own decisions, to disobey when necessary. You turn them into machines, but machines can be turned off. As if to prove his point, Jack blew the whistle one last time. Not a command, but the special sequence he and Apollo had developed for extreme emergency situations, when all other options had failed. The effect was immediate. Apollo stopped trembling, his entire body becoming rigid for a moment. His eyes, which had been alternating between the emptiness of conditioning and sparks of recognition, finally fixed on Jack with a clarity he hadn't shown since their reunion. No, Thompson frantically pressed the buttons on his device. Apollo, Sigma Protocol, primary command. But it was too late. The cord holding the muzzle gave way when Apollo shook his head forcefully, freeing himself for the first time since he had been captured. His eyes now shone with that familiar intensity that Jack had missed so much, the look of a warrior finally awakening from a long nightmare. "Welcome back, partner," Jack smiled, tears of joy forming in his eyes. Apollo took a step forward, completely ignoring Thompson's increasingly desperate commands. Each of his movements now overflowed with that feline grace that had made him legendary in military service, the perfect combination of power and precision. "Impossible," Thompson muttered, his face pale with shock. The conditioning was perfect. "You never understood, did you?" Jack said, watching as Apollo positioned himself by his side, exactly as he did during missions. "It's not about conditioning or control, it's about choice, and Apollo always knew how to choose the right side." The sound of sirens began to echo in the distance, rapidly approaching. Thompson and his men exchanged nervous glances, clearly realizing that the situation had completely escaped their control. "Sarah," Jack smiled, recognizing his sister's perfect timing, always prepared. Apollo let out a deep bark, not a threat but a warning. It was the same sound he used during missions to indicate that he had identified suspects trying to flee. Thompson and his men were cornered, and they knew it. 3 months had passed since the night at the abandoned factory. Jack's backyard, once marked by the holes of Apollo's anxiety, now displayed a small garden that Sarah had insisted on planting. To symbolize the new beginning, she had said. Apollo rested on the grass, his body relaxed under the afternoon sun. There was no longer any sign of constant fear in his eyes, although some emotional scars still persisted. Occasionally, a louder noise would still startle him, but now he sought comfort in Jack's presence instead of hiding. The investigation that followed Thompson's arrest revealed the full extent of his experiments. Dozens of military dogs had been subjected to the Sigma Protocol, an unauthorized program aimed at creating perfect canine soldiers through extreme conditioning techniques. Jack watched Apollo playing with a toy, a behavior that would have been unthinkable a few months ago, while reading the latest report sent by Robert. The case had reached the highest echelons of military command, resulting in a complete restructuring of the service dog rehabilitation program. "He's so different," Sarah commented, joining her brother on the porch. "Anyone who sees him now wouldn't imagine everything he's been through." Jack smiled, noticing how Apollo immediately perked up his ears at the sound of Sarah's voice. The connection the dog had developed with her in recent weeks was further proof of his recovery. "I just received an interesting proposal," Jack said, showing an email on his cell phone. "They're creating a new rehabilitation center for military dogs. They want me to take over the coordination." Sarah's eyes widened. "And are you going to accept?" "I think so," he replied, observing Apollo. "Someone needs to ensure that what happened to them never happens again. And who better than us to do that?" As if understanding that he was being discussed, Apollo got up and walked over to them, sitting at Jack's feet with that dignified posture that characterized him. His eyes, now full of life again, alternated between the two humans with interest. "And the best part," Jack continued, scratching Apollo's head, "they want Apollo to be part of the program, as a therapy dog for other traumatized animals." Sarah laughed. "Who would have thought, huh? from patient to therapist. The sound of a car passing on the street caught Apollo's attention. Unlike the first days after the rescue, now he just observed with curiosity, without fear. The conditioning of the Sigma protocol had been completely broken, replaced by regained trust. You know what impresses me the most, Sarah reflected. How he managed to maintain his essence even after everything. The loyalty, the intelligence, the capacity to love. None of that was really lost. Jack nodded, remembering the night at the factory. That's why Thompson's experiments were doomed to fail. He tried to turn them into machines, but he forgot that the true strength of a military dog comes precisely from its ability to feel, to care. Apollo let out a small bark, as if agreeing. His tail wagged gently as he rested his head on Jack's knee, a gesture of affection that had naturally returned with recovery. "And what about the other dogs?" Sarah asked. "The ones who were also subjected to the Sigma protocol?" "They're being located and rescued," Jack replied. "Some have already been found in situations similar to Apollo's, abandoned in shelters or on the streets. The new center will receive all of them." A familiar sound made Apollo perk up his ears. It was the food truck arriving for the weekly delivery. Before Jack could get up, the dog was already on his way to the gate, his posture relaxed but alert. "Look at that," Sarah laughed. "Back to being a professional." Jack watched with pride as Apollo politely accompanied the delivery man to the door. There was no more fear in his movements, just that situational awareness that had made him an exceptional military dog. "You know, Sarah," Jack said, "sometimes I think it was us who rescued Apollo, but actually, it was he who rescued both of you," she completed, smiling. "Gave you a new purpose and him a second chance." Apollo returned to join them, lying down again on the grass. The afternoon sun cast soft shadows across the yard, and a gentle breeze stirred the newly planted flowers. It was a scene of peace that, months ago, seemed impossible. "I think we all deserve a second chance," Jack reflected, watching his partner finally at peace. "And sometimes it comes from where we least expect it." End of story. Dear listeners, we hope that Jack and Apollo's journey has touched your hearts. This story of overcoming trust and new beginnings shows us that true bonds are stronger than any adversity. For more equally moving stories, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications. Share your impressions in the comments and tell us about special stories of friendship and overcoming that you know. Together we can create a community where inspiring stories like this find their place. Until next time.